Shabbos Shira, and we are up to the Gemara here on Daf Pei Vav. Actually, just one thing about Shabbos Shira, Chassidim used to go visit the Rebbe's of Shabbos Shira. Was a big Shabbos. There was one particular Chassid who went to his Rebbe. Can't remember exactly which Rebbe it was, and it was Parshas boy. And his Rebbe said to him, "You're a week early. Everyone comes with Shalach. Why are you doing a boy?" He's telling him a fair Shigamar in Kedushin. Mitzvah boy Yosef B'Shluchai. It's a play on words, because really there's talking about it that it's a bigger mitzvah for you to go yourself than sending an agent to represent you. Over here, we say that the Parshas boy comes ahead of Parshas B'Shalach. Anyway, just a quick recap of what we did so far. We had a question that was posed by Rabba. So we learned that if you wound somebody, you have to pay 5 different kinds of damages. One was nezik, the damage. One was tsar, the pain. One was ripa, the medical bills. And one was sheva's unemployment bills, he can't work. And then was baish's shame. Nezik, we determined that when we value the nezik, how do we value it? You no longer are capable of doing the work that you were performing before. So we put you on the slave market. What is your value when you were able to perform these functions, and now that you cannot perform these functions? So you can no longer perform the major, but we pay you for that. But then at least you could have been a security guard. But now that you're sick in bed, you can't even do that. So that's where the unemployment benefits come. So unemployment benefits is not for what your normal job is. That you're already covered by Nezik. It's from at least you could have been a security guard or something similar, which is a low-paid job, but you can't even do that now because you're lying in bed. If you had a very, very special skill and you were able to do that, even with a hezek that you had, then when we pay you the unemployment benefits, we pay you what you would have received doing that skilled job, and now you're not doing it. So Rabbi came along and asked an interesting question. What happens if somebody causes you, wounds you, let's say, makes your hand shrivel, so you can no longer perform your work, you got to pay the unemployment benefits. But what about the actual hezek itself? Because this is a temporary hezek. You hang shriveled, over time, on its own, the hand will recover. So it's a temporary loss of the use of the hand. Do you pay the nezik for temporary loss or not? And that's the question we are up to. And so we brought a brisa where we brought actually a Mishnah. It says if you strike your parents, the din is normally if you strike your parents and cause them to bleed, you're chayiv misa. But you wound your parents, but you did not cause them to bleed. So the din is that you have to pay for all the different 5 payments. And we're wondering, how is it possible to wound them without making them bleed? So first we thought maybe they made them deaf. But we said it's impossible to make somebody deaf. Let's say you hit them in the ear or something. There must be some internal bleeding. So then you'd be chayiv misa regardless. So then the Gemara said, you know what we're talking about? We're up to right here, the Gemara. We'll start with the Gemara here that you gave him a haircut. So we're up to the Gemara here, about 6 lines at the top of the page in Pei Bava Kama Daf. About 7 lines. El Halchamais Kid. You know what we're talking about? You wounded your let's say your father. You wounded him, but there was no bleeding. You gave a haircut, and by giving him a haircut, you caused him harm, but there was no bleeding. So you have to pay the 5 different payments. Says the Gemara, Gilchu Maheder Hada. What happens to give a haircut? Eventually, the hair grows back. And yet you're telling me that you have to make the 5 forms of payment. So that resolves Rabba's question. A temporary wound, you still have to pay as if you put him on the slave market right now. So what happens if you put someone in the slave market right now? Let's say they're normally worth $500. Because of this wound, even though they know that 99.9% of the chance it's going to grow back or it's going to be normal, the fact that right now this person does not have any hair, right now people are not going to pay the full value. They say, oh, there's always a risk. There's always a little bit of a risk. They're not going to pay the full value. They're not going to pay the face value. They'll pay some kind of a discount. So therefore, what do you call it? That is the amount of the hezek. And it's behind the bar. That's our question. You should pay it. I'm reading my skin. We say, no, there's no proof there. You know, we're talking about a permanent damage. What's permanent damage? And therefore, we don't know what the law would be if it's temporary damage. What's the permanent damage without causing them to bleed? What kind of wound is that? you put some kind of a potion in the head that causes the hair to fall out and the follicles came out with it, and it'll never regrow. And therefore it's a permanent damage. Now, what exactly is a damage? So you give somebody a haircut, or they lost the hair. What's exactly the damage? The nezek. We're not talking about shame and others. We're talking about the nezek. The damage is when you have a head full of hair, it protects you from the cold. But if you don't have any hair, there's nothing to protect your head. So that's the damage. Says Gemara, okay, I understand how it's possible to have damage and with a wound with no bleeding. But Sarah, what's the pain? If we're talking about a haircut, okay, and you put some potion to remove the hair permanently, what is the pain? What does you know the pain is? The East Lake he has cracks in his dry skin, very dry skin, his cracks. But and he screams out, Mahanu Kartufne. And when you put that potion, whatever is in there, that's very toxic, and it goes into these cracks and it causes a lot of pain. That's the pain. Ripui, the medical bills, the bayasu, you have to heal those cracks. Shev is the unemployment. Well, what does that do with unemployment? Being bald? To have a marki bekubi. This guy was a clown. And part of the performance of a clown is he has to go ahead and tilt his head. The boy mechve gavna aresha. He has to go and move his head about and show the people his head. Loy mechve mahani katufne. But he can't show them because there's all these cracks in his skull. When he has a head full of hair, nobody notices it. But now they do. He's embarrassed. So he can't perform. He can't do his work. He got to pay his unemployment. And boish's shame ain't like boish's god mazu. What greater shame is it than being bold? So interesting. Rashi, the Gemara, there's a Tan in the Gemara called Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, and we know Rabbi Akiva had a son called Rabbi Yeshua. So Rashi claimed that Rabbi Akiva's son was Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Now Karcha in Hebrew means the baldy, so they nicknamed Rabbi Akiva the baldy, and his son was called Rabbi Yeshua, the son of the baldy. Taisus finds that abhorrent, that they should call a rabbi by the name of the baldy, especially Rabbi Akiva, and call this kid. But the rest of his life, he has to walk around with the stigma that he is a son of a baldy. But the Gemara right here says that a baldy is actually a very shameful, it's a derogatory term. So I guess in today's times when it's so prevalent, obviously in those days, it was not prevalent at all. It was very rare. So let's continue Gemara. So the bottom line is we haven't resolved Rabba's question. What happens at temporary damage? Says Gemara, it's actually an argument. The mills of the boiler Rabba, that very issue that Rabba asked, Rabbi and Rabba argue about this very point. Even we learned the following: He keyu al yodin. One person, hits the other person on the hand. Vitsamsa, as a result, the hand shrivels up. But the sefer lachzer, just give it some time, it'll come back to its original form. So what do you do now? So first of all, he cannot perform the work, so you have to give him unemployment. What about the damage? Currently, if he would be put on the slave market, he'd be worth less than he would be, prior to this. On the other hand, you wait a month, he'll be back to normal. So Abai says, Noisin le'sheves gedoyle and v'sheves ktana. He says that no, we go to the slave market and he gets paid for the temporary damage, and then so that brings it down to becoming a security guard. And now, because for whatever reason he can't even do that, we pay him for that. If he's lying in bed, whatever, because the hand hurts, so then you would pay him for the unemployment of not being able to be security guard. Shevis town is called the large unemployment and the small unemployment. And Rabbi says, you only pay him the unemployment, you don't pay him for the hezek. But interesting, according to Rabbi, if you're paying for the unemployment, since we're not paying him for the hezek, then the unemployment is what he was getting. So if he was getting, if he wasn't a security guard, he was much more had much more sophisticated job, but getting paid a lot more. Then now that he can't perform that, he'll get the full unemployment benefits. So at the end of the day, Abai and Rav are not really arguing. It's just a question of semantics, because at the end of the Abai holds, it's two payments, but basically you're paying him what he could have been earning, and Rav says it's just one payment, but what he could have been earning. What's the difference? So the Rosh says no. According to Rav, let's say he was a computer programmer working all day intensely and getting, let's say, $100 a week, and as a security guard you only get 20. So according to Rava, it's not that we give him $100 a week because you cannot perform right now because you're in pain and so on. What we do is you say to him, you're getting $100 a week, you got to work 8 hours a day and sit there at the screen the whole time and look and think. How much would you be prepared to take a week and do absolutely nothing? For $70 a week, would you be happy to take $70 a week and you have to do nothing? You don't have to wake up in the morning, you don't have to look at the screen, do absolutely nothing. And that is the amount you pay. So not the full wage, but what he would be happy to forego that full wage in his current situation where he's not doing anything. Itmar, another argument about Rabbi we had. Let's say somebody amputates the hand of a Jewish slave of his friend. Abaye says, well, the damage was to the Eved himself, so the Eved is entitled to that damage. But the Sheves Ketana l'Rab. But you give him, the fact is, this guy sold himself as a slave. Obviously, he was destitute, so he sells himself, and that money he gives it to his family to provide for them, and he becomes a slave. So the person pre-bought and prepaid this slave. But we learned a law that says that what happens, you purchase a slave, and the slave then becomes sick, and for a couple of years can't perform it at all. You cannot ask a slave for your money back. You can't prorate or anything else. We say in his it's your tough luck. Your field got flooded. Or floods, nothing you can do about it. But if we said if it's more than 4 years, then maybe you have to make some of the time up. So therefore, even though the master owns the slave, doesn't own the slave, he owns the work of the slave. But even the work of the slave, he doesn't really own it because if the guy got sick, then it's your tough luck. So therefore, we say the major loser in this is the Eved himself, because now he's worth less on the slave market. But he could have been a security guard, something. He has to do some performance of work for this owner. So therefore, that's what he gets as unemployment benefit. He could have been a security guard. Rabbi says, and that goes to the master because the master prepaid for it. He's entitled to that. However, Rabbi says, "Hakol yinos and love." Give everything to the slave. The yilkel behen karka, but you purchase, you make an investment, you put property. Harav oichel paydes, but who gets the dividends while he's a slave? The master. So Gemara concludes, Pshita, that's for sure. Piches eitzel atzmei. What happens if the only one who loses out on it is a slave, as we'll soon see how? The eitzel rabba picha, but it doesn't impact whatsoever adversely for the, as far as the master is concerned. The functionality is still all right. Just appearance maybe has been distorted. Heichidami, for example, the paskel goes over and cuts off the tip of the slave's ear, or the tip of his nose. Doesn't affect the master at all. So therefore, any loss, any money, any monetary compensation goes directly to the slave. Hakoila atzma goes to the slave. But piches eitzel rabbi. But if let's say it impacts the master, his work, the performance, like the shriveled hand, then pluk to the Bava Rabba. That's the argument of Bava Rabba. What goes to the slave and what goes to the master? Boishes, when it comes to shame, how do we quantify shame? So the Mishnah says it's all relative. It's the only thing, there's no absolute thing. Depends who the person is embarrassed, who's on the receiving end, and who's the one who's dishing it out. If the person on the receiving end is an ordinary person, maybe it's not so bad. But if it's a dignified person, and it's far more, it's far more hurtful. And vice versa, if the person who is I guess dehumanizing you, is a dignified person, it's far more hurtful than just some ordinary person off the street. So that's what our mission says, all relative, but it's not so straightforward as we have an argument in the Gemara as follows: 3 opinions. Boishes, shame, hakol fi amavayis. Our mission says it's all relative depending on who the people are involved. Mani must listen. So who's the author of Mishnah? Loy Rab Meir. It's not Rab Meir. Loy Rab Yud, not Rab Yehuda. Ela Rab Shimoni. What's going on? Now we learn. Rab Meir says every Jew is equal. We don't care about the socioeconomic status. We don't care about all that. The kulan. How do we view every Jew, rich or poor? Roinoi said we see what makes you Jewish. The fact that we are Jewish. That's it. So the rest doesn't matter. The rest is all extra baggage. It doesn't matter. So therefore, we look at every Jew. Every Jew is a free person. They have no assets. All and what they have going for them. Avram, the Yisrael children, and therefore everyone is a uniform price. Everyone gets the same amount of money when it comes to shame. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Hagodol if he godlev, it all depends. Somebody is higher up in the economic circles, somebody in academic circles, then it's more hurtful as opposed to somebody who's not. So therefore, it's all relative, and you have to judge each case on its merits. Rav Shimon says it sort of halfway. When it comes to the Ashirim, he says, let's not make a big deal about money. So we're going to reduce them a couple of notches and treat them like middle class. We're going to treat them like the middle class and no longer rich. They are ordinary people and whatever the shame is. But when it comes to Aniyim, so that party agrees with Rab Meir. But when it comes to Rabbi Yehuda, when it comes to poor people, he said, I don't agree with Rab Meir that, everyone's equal. They're not equal. The shame would be far less. They have other things to worry about. So in that case, I'm going to say that Aniyim kitchusim shebem. We can take Aniyim and drop them a few notches, like somebody who's in a very, I guess they have so many tzaddis of their own, they don't even notice the fact that they're being embarrassed. So Mani, who's also a Mishnah, If it's Rab Meir, Maslisik Tani, our Mishnah says, Hakol Lipfi Hamavayish, all relative. And Rab Meir says, Kul Vadadoni, everyone's equal. The Rabbi Yehuda, and if it's Rabbi Yehuda, Maslisik on our Mishnah says, Hamavayish says Sumachai. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, our Mishnah says, it cannot be Rabbi Yehuda. You know it's Rabbi Yehuda? From a Brisa. Our Mishnah says that if you embarrass a blind person, you shame them, you have to pay. Yet Rabbi Yehuda in a Brisa says that if a blind person shamed you, the blind person is exempt, does not have to pay. So now, even though our Mishnah is talking about on the receiving end, and Rabbi Yehuda is talking about the one who's dishing out, but Rabbi Yehuda then says if you're asleep and somebody embarrassed you, you have to pay. But if you're asleep and you fell off the bed and you landed on top of somebody in a very embarrassing position, you don't have to pay because you were not aware. But he doesn't make that separation when it comes to a blind person. Which means Rabbi Yehuda holds that a blind person is always. He holds that a blind person is what do you call it? Is always potter, whether you were the one who's receiving in, whether you embarrass somebody else, a blind person potter. So our Mishnah that says that if you embarrass a blind person's chayiv, clearly our Mishnah does not agree with Rabbi Yehuda. So it can't be that our Mishnah the author is Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda, I'm assuming a blind person, if you shame them, is no big deal. Our Mishnah must be Rabbi Shimon. Says the Gemara, I feel Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe I can argue, not like we just said, but maybe when does Rabbi Yehuda say Sumein leBoishes? When does Rabbi Yehuda say a blind person there's no shame, laws of shame, limishko minei? If he embarrasses somebody else, he doesn't have to pay. But if you embarrass a blind person, then you have been maybe you do have to pay. Most it can't be because Miktani Sefer later on it says in the Brisa, I'm a vayish a yosha. That if you embarrass a sleeping person, chayiv. It says if you embarrass, it says in our Mishnah, if you embarrass a sleeping person, you chayiv. And the Yoshon Shabai bias, but if a sleeping person embarrassed somebody else, potter, because he didn't know what he's doing. And we don't make that same contrast when a blind person. So clearly, our Mishnah holds that a blind person on the receiving end is chayiv, but giving, whether you're receiving or whether you're giving, you're always chayiv. Whether he's embarrassing others. And Rabbi Yehuda clearly said if a blind person embarrassed somebody else, they're exonerated. So our Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yehuda. But like Tani Summa should be as potter. It doesn't say if a blind person embarrassed as potter. Miklal v'sif made the loishna hachi makes no difference. According to our Mishnah, a blind person is always responsible if he embarrassed somebody else or if he's on the receiving end. It's clear that Maslisin Rab Shimon that Mishnah Rab Shimon. Second further, we have another Brisa, Mantan, who's also what we learned. If you intended, so here, if you cause damage, we don't care what your intention is. You cause damage, you're always responsible. A human being is always responsible, whether it's your fault, not your fault, it's irrelevant. You're always responsible. When it comes to shaming somebody, it's only if it's intentional. So now the question is, what happens? I intended to shame somebody, but it wasn't you. I intended to shame somebody else, and I said something. It turned out to be I talked about the wrong person. It was actually somebody else, and I embarrassed that other person. Do I need to pay or not? So when it comes to murder, we say, if I wanted, you're not responsible unless you intended to kill. According to Rab Shimon, if I intended to kill Reuven, and by mistake I killed Shimon, the Chacham say, I wanted to commit murder, so I'm a murderer. And Rab Shimon says, no. I have to not only intend to commit the crime, but I have to intend to commit the crime on this particular person. So we're going to say, according to Rab Shimon, the same thing applies to shaming someone. If I intended to shame someone, but I shamed the wrong person, then it's then according to Rab Shimon, you're not liable because you have to intend to shame the right person. So the Brisa is as follows. This Kabbalah by the cotton, you intended to embarrass a cotton. So right now we think cotton means somebody, economically perhaps is not affluent, let's say lower class. Well, instead you embarrass somebody from the upper class. So it says you intended to embarrass. Let's say if you intended to embarrass a person in the lower class, it's a $50 fine. If you intended to embarrass someone from the upper class, it's $200 fine. But I intended to embarrass somebody from the lower class. By mistake, I embarrassed somebody in the high class. But all my intention was $50 worth. So all I have to pay to the person from the upper class is $50. So what I have to pay the other person, what I was intending to do with the person from the lower class. What happened in Levi is that I intended to embarrass a slave, will be Eshes Ben Chayden. Instead, I turned out to embarrass a Ben Chayden, or didn't realize this very person I thought was a slave turned out to be he was free. He's been emancipated. So I don't have to pay him the amount of money I would have to give an Ebed. Now, man, who's also the Mishnah? What do you mean? Because Kasadi Mark explains the problem. We thought cotton means cotton ben chas, somebody he doesn't have many assets. Godel means godel chas, he has many assets. So Ira Meir says we don't look at the status, the person's status in the community. Every Jew is equal. All Jews are equal. So what's the difference? Cotton godel. Rabbi Yehuda Hamadi says he holds ein la'avodim boishes. Rabbi Yehuda says that there's no laws of shame if you denigrate or disparage a slave. You don't have to pay for shaming because the very fact that they're a slave is already a shameful. His whole persona is one idea of shame. So you're not adding another layer. It's nothing. So there's nothing to talk about. The Rav Shimon says that if you intended to in this according to Shimon, you'd be exempt because I never intended to embarrass the godel. I only intended to embarrass the cotton. This Kalabai is ever be is that part. My time of wife it's like murder. Mark told when it comes to murder, Adam is you have to intend not just to murder, but to commit it against this very person. The Chassidut says, "But out of law, you become Allah that you have ambushed him and you jumped on him. Achi is you have to intend this very person. So boish is nami shem also Adam but you have to intend to embarrass this person. The Chassidut says. When these two men are fighting, one of them is her husband. So the woman grabs a hold of the embarrassing parts of the other person that she has to pay for embarrassing that other person. And there she intended to embarrass the very person that she ended up embarrassing. She grabbed a hold of his embarrassing parts. Until you have to have in mind that very person. So who's the author of this Bryce? Rabbi Yehuda says and there's no laws of shame when you embarrass an Eved, you don't have to pay them. That's talking about you don't have to give them any money because they're already, you didn't add another labor embarrassment. The very fact that they're a slave, that's the most embarrassing thing you can have. But if I embarrass somebody else and I need to work out, but I intended to embarrass a slave, I need to work out. So what's the value? Then I can value what is the value of shaming a slave, and that's what I pay to the other person. When he said ain't boish it means you don't transfer any money to the Eved. Is to give them money directly. To assess what the value of that shame that we do. Who told you that Godel means economically this person is affluent or vice versa? Me sorry, Godel rich in assets and cotton means cotton chasim. No. Like Godel mamish. You know what Godel means an adult? Cotton means a minor. Now, if you can ask me a minor, you embarrass a minor is a law, you have to pay money. The cotton babaishazu, can you even, they don't even understand, they don't process it, you didn't really embarrass them. So we answer Kidamara Papa. The Papa said that different levels of maturity. Some Ketanim are mature enough. And what's the telltale sign? The if you remind them later on when they grow up about an event that happened when they were a child, and they become embarrassed then an adult of how they behaved and so on and so forth, that means they're mature enough to know that they should have been better. Here too. So by the child that's older, and therefore there is such a thing as shame, even though it's not the same as an adult, but there's something there. So the Mishnah. If you embarrass somebody that's naked, you embarrass somebody who's blind, you embarrass somebody who's asleep. They're all you're chayiv for that because eventually they become aware. But the yashan should be yash if somebody is asleep and turn over to sleep and fell on somebody in a compromising position, whatever it is, they had no idea what they were doing. Not from, and remember, you have to have intent when it comes to paying for shame, for embarrassing someone. Not from in a guy fell off a roof, the hizik, and he caused damage. Now, when it comes to damage, we don't care whether it's your fault or not. Ubiyash, and he also caused shame. Chayiv ala nezik. You are chayiv for the damage. Upoter ala boishes. You're exempt for paying for the shame. Why is that? Until you had intention. Says the Gemara. Torabon, the Brisa says, "Baishoy orim." If you embarrass somebody who's naked, chayiv, you have to pay them money. But you cannot fear the amount of money that you have to pay, or the kind of shame it is when somebody's already naked. Somebody's fully dressed and you cause them shame. So obviously, the one's fully dressed, the shame is far greater. Then the Brisa continues. Somebody's in the bathhouse undressed, and you embarrass them, chayiv, because you still embarrass them. But you cannot compare that kind of embarrassment. The base America is if they're out in the street fully dressed, and you embarrass them there. Let's understand the brisa. Alamar, you just said, Baisha Orum Chayiv. If the person is naked and you embarrass them, you chayiv. Orum Bar Baishazu. Person is naked. Well, what else can you be doing that's embarrassing them? Omar Papa said, naked here doesn't mean fully naked. You know what naked means? The Asa Zika, a wind came along, Kachina Leman, it lifted the person's dress, a garment, the Asa who, and then you, the perpetrator, came along, the Linu Tfei, you lifted a bit higher, Ubaishas. So the shame is not so great because already the dress or whatever was lifted up, and you just lift up a bit further. Compare that to somebody fully dressed. And that's what he means. Toysa has a problem with this shot we just said because Toysa says, then why is the Gemara asking the question on the Brisa? We could have asked the very question on the Mishnah. The Mishnah says if you embarrass somebody who's naked, you can ask a question. They're already naked. What do you mean embarrassed? So Toysa says, in the Mishnah, when we say you embarrass somebody naked, you know what embarrass it is? You spat in front of them. And because you spat in front of them, doesn't matter the person is naked or not naked, fully dressed. It's the spitting in front of them that denigration that is terrible. So therefore, we have no problem with the Mishnah. It's only in the Brisa that draws a contrast between somebody who's fully clothed or partially clothed. So if it was a case of spitting in front of them, what's the difference? Must be talking about you lifted the garments. It's one thing, you're fully dressed, it's embarrassing. But they're naked, what's a big deal? So we answer that only partially naked. Then the Gemara continues. Ba'ishav is America's chayv. You embarrass them in the base of Americans in the bathhouse, they're all undressed anyway, you're chayv. Based on Merchas Bar Boishla, what shame are you doing there? Amar Papa said, you know what happened here? It wasn't in a bathhouse, it was out in public near a river. And therefore, it's embarrassing. So now the one has a very interesting question. What exactly are you paying for when you're shaming, are you embarrassing a person in public? And you have to pay. Torah says you embarrass, you have to pay. What are you paying for? Are you paying for the activity itself of embarrassing somebody? Or is it the outcome because this person now is so uncomfortable, embarrassed to go out in public again? It's the hurt. It's that's hurt that you caused that person. And I guess it explains a little bit the arguments we had before. If it's a subjective thing, because it's to do with the hurt of the person, every person reacts differently. Therefore, there are different amounts you have to pay depending on the person on the receiving end, the giving end, and so on. But if you learn it's just a very activity that I, said something disparaging to you in front of you, and that is wrong, that's why I have to pay, then maybe in that case it's uniform, everybody has to pay the same amount. Anyway, that's a question as we'll see in a minute. What happens as follows? You embarrass somebody who was asleep, and he died before he woke up to find out what happened. Mahu, you have to pay or not? What's the question? This is the question. Why am I paying money when you shame somebody? Is it mishum kisufu? Is it because you embarrassed him and he now feels this person on the receiving end is emotionally hurt from it? But he died, never emotionally hurt. But Leslie Kasufa, it never happened. Is that it? It's not to do with him, it's to do with me. Because I made disparaging remarks in public. And therefore, even that person was not even aware of it. Well, I made those remarks. So who cares if he died afterwards? I should still have to pay. Toshba coming here, so you want to try to resolve it from the following brisa. The Meir says, if you embarrass a minor or somebody's deaf, there's shame there. Okay, somebody's deaf, maybe you can read your lips, but a minor can't even process it. There is laws of shame, you got to pay. But shaitan, if the person is mentally challenged, because shame doesn't mean he doesn't understand the word you're saying, it means nothing. So now we're trying to understand why a minor, and you put them to shame, they don't understand. Why do you have to pay? So that it's not so much the effect on the person, it's the remarks that I made. Then that's why it makes sense for a minor you have to pay. If you're going to tell me bishum kisufa, if you can tell me it's because the outcome, the person is embarrassed, so why pay any money at all for a minor? So your mother retorts, Elamai, what do you want to say, Mr. Zulus, right? The disparaging comments. So how come you're exonerated if it was a shaitan? Who cares who's on the receiving end? If I made disparaging comments, I should have to pay, even though the person is a shaitan. I feel shaitanami. Amri, the Gemara says, no. Shaita ain't like busha gedei l'mazu. I added nothing. If a person is a shaita, that in itself is an embarrassment. So whatever comment I make doesn't add anything to the very nature of that person. So Gemara says, fine, but it still doesn't resolve our question. Let's resolve the fact that you're charging me for embarrassing a minor must be that it's not so much the minor the receiving it, it's more the remarks that I made. It's just because I made all these terrible comments. Because if it's because of the shame of that person, does he understand? Says Gemara, yes. Papa said, and we already mentioned before, the if you recount to him and you remind him how he acted in such a foolish way, he gets embarrassed again. It means that he's mature enough to understand. Rav Papa said, you misunderstood the question of Rabbi Abba Bamamon. This is his question, which is very interesting. If you embarrass a person in public, who's hurt by it? Is it just the person that you embarrassed, or his family as well? Because now they're the brother, sister, mother, son, daughter of this particular person, so they also feel embarrassed, and that's what I'm paying for, and that's the question. Mishum kisufa didahu, we only look in isolation of this person, and the person died if you don't have to pay. But Ma'isla, he's dead. Or is it because I embarrassed the entire family is embarrassed, and they're still alive, so I got to pay. We go through the same process again. Tashma. You have to pay for the shame. But a fool doesn't. If it's with the family, I understand. The kid doesn't understand, but the family does. That's what we have to pay. Because of the shame. Cotton bar a child is a shame. My mother retorts, are you telling me why? Because of the family. So how come by a shaita you don't have to pay? I feel a shaita nami. So we answer, shaita, you don't think families are already embarrassed if they have somebody in the family who's a shaita? They're already embarrassed. You're not adding anything. Say, okay, let's resolve our question. Let's resolve the fact that I have to pay for a minor means it's really the family. The a child is a shame. There are some children that are mature enough that when you embarrass them, they feel it. For Tanya, we actually to support that, we learned in the Brisa, Rebbe says, Chedesh, yesh lebaisha. So what is that? You embarrass them, you have to pay. Sheita, ain't lebaisha, they don't pay. And cotton a child, a minor, pa'amim yesh le'pa'mela. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. How do we work it out? If you embarrass him, you remind him later if there's an embarrassing thing, or gets embarrassed the second time, then you know he's mature, then you have to pay. If he doesn't, then you don't have to. If you embarrass a blind person, says the Gemara, so it says if you embarrass a blind person, you have to pay. Masnisin obviously like Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to see Rabbi Yehuda holds in a number of trenches. He develops this idea that a blind person, in a way, I guess the handicap, the challenge of being blind, exempts him from this layer. Actually, by the two dots of the page. Yeah. You our mission says you have to hold that a blind.
Something's happening to the sound. I don't know what, it's breaking up.
One second. Can you hear me now?
Now we can. Yeah, just come back.
Okay. So we're up to the Gemara that pay vav on the bay by the two dots. Our Mishnah said that if you embarrass a blind person, you have to pay for that. And our Mishnah said Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a blind person, you don't have to pay a blind person for that. And in fact, he says that any particular punishment in the Torah does not apply to a blind person. So let's see the Gemara, about 12 lines at the bottom of the page, pay vav on the bays. He says, Masnisin, our Mishnah is the like Rabbi Yehuda, does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya we learned, Rabbi Yehuda says, Stuma ein lebaysh is a blind person. There's no laws of shame. You don't have to pay a blind person if you're embarrassed. Why not? But Rabbi Yehuda also said, if a blind person killed someone by mistake, anybody else would have to run to one of the cities of refuge, but not a blind person. Number one. Number two. Number three. Malchus. If somebody eats not kosher, warned by two witnesses, they go to court, they have to pay, get 39 lashes. However, Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person will not get punished; they won't administer these lashes. Furthermore, somebody who desecrates the Shabbos, Machal Shabbos, and the two witnesses, you have to stone them. But if the person is blind, you don't. Says the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. Let's understand Rabbi Yehuda. First of all, how come if you embarrass a blind person, don't you have to pay? Says the Gemara, you know how? Because where do you learn out the whole concept of shaming somebody? Sorry, how come you shame a blind person, you have to pay? Where do you learn shaming from? The case of the woman who tries to defend her husband against that other a man that he's struggling with, she grabs a hold of that man's shameful parts. And the pasuk there says you have to, she's penalized. And the pasuk says there, loisachas einecha. You should not have any pity with your eyes. When it comes to it says in the pasuk there, it says the same expression when you have witnesses who were found to be liars. They were somewhere else at the same time. You have to punish the witnesses, and you use the exact same expression. Now, what do we know about witnesses? One thing we know for sure. They cannot be blind. If a witness are blind, how in the world can they come to court and say, I saw, this person did that? You couldn't have seen anything. So since a witness cannot be blind, so too when it comes to shame, it can, if a blind person, there's no laws of shame. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Make like Zeri Shabbos. My Rabbi Yehuda Gomer, he lives out from these false witnesses. My husband there, Sumiloi, blind people know. Avacha Sumiloi, blind people know. Then we continue. Mechayav goes, how do you know that a blind person? How do you know that a blind person, if he kills someone by accident, doesn't have to go to Syria refuge? The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa from the pasuk. The pasuk says if he entered into the forest to chop wood, and then the handle fell off, he went flying, and umatas re'eyu, and it came across your friend v'meis, and that person died. You should run to one of these cities, and the pasuk says there that you did not notice your friend come. It says that you did not notice your friend come at all. You did not notice your friend come at all. It says that you didn't see. Now, what do you mean you didn't see? That was an accident. Beloy sounds like you could have seen, but you didn't. So we're not talking about a blind person. A blind person can never see. So therefore, the fact that they try to highlight Beloy means that a blind person should have to go. A blind person is exempt from these rules completely. So that's the Tanya we learned. B'lei rois prat l'suma. Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person is exempt because it says b'lei rois that at the moment you didn't see, but generally you could see. Rameir says on the contrary, l'rabba is suma. To tell you, a blind person also has to seek a haven in a city of refuge. My time with Rabbi Yehuda. What's the logic of Rabbi Yehuda? I will tell you very simply. It says in the pasuk, you met your friend in the forest, and chopping wood. So that pasuk sounds like anybody. It doesn't matter who you are. Feel so blind. But then Kasser Rachmater writes, at this juncture you didn't see. At this moment you didn't see. But generally you can't see. So Lemute comes to exclude a blind person. But a mayor Kasser, a mayor says no. It says Beloy Ra'is Lemute. Rameir says, I agree with you. I grant you that. The lay rise comes to exclude a blind person not included. But then the next pasuk says, it says then later on, well, actually the pasuk before, bivlidas, that you weren't aware, which means generally you could have been aware. In other words, you're a seeing person, but you weren't aware now. So we have two psukim, both of them excluding a blind person. And we have a general rule, when you have one exclusion and repeat it again, it comes not to exclude, but to include. Having miyut achamid, one exclusion after another, it comes to include. And which is a very strange. Taisha says, I don't understand this principle, and it remains the question. And Taisha's question is very simple. If the Torah wanted to include blind people, don't have any exclusions. Why have a double exclusion? Have no exclusions, and how would we read the pasuk? Anybody walks into the forest, chopping wood, kills somebody by mistake, has to go to the Ari Miklat. Why have any exclusions? I don't understand this whole idea of having a double exclusion to cancel each other out and you're back to normal. don't have either one. So some want to say that the exclusion comes to exclude something else, not this, and therefore we need it. And you got to work out each time what it is. Anyway, Rabbi Yehuda, what does he do with the words unaware? Ahu beblidas pratim miskaven. Unaware means that it was unintentional. Because if he did intentionally, even though there were no witnesses, we're not going to let him run to another miklat. We're going to say the next of kin have a right to take revenge. Chayavi Mrs. Bezin. Why do we say that a blind person, if he, let's say, if he machal Shabbos and there were witnesses, we're not going to stone him? Asi, we learn out roitzeach mechayavi goyus. Once we've established that a blind person does not go to Ari Miklat, and we find the word Russia that talks about a murder, and we find the word Russia as well when it talks about running to the to these cities, and we talk about Russia as well when it comes to a punishment. So therefore, we know from that where are we? So we know from that there's no Mrs. Bezin, not only city of refuge, but Bezin will not administer the death penalty to a blind person. We learn Ritzeach, from the city of refuge. We compare all other dinim as well. Chayav Malkis, how you know that if there were Adam sown each race, and they warned him he won't get lashes. Asya, Russia, we learn out Russia, Mechayavi Mrs. Bezin. By Chayavi Mrs. Bezin, when it comes to punishments, capital punishments, it says the word Russia. It says also the word Russia when it comes to by Malchus. So therefore, we compare the two, and we say just like by Malchus, it says by Misa, it says he's a Russia deserves to die, and Malchus we learn from Misa, and Misa we don't punish blind people, nor do we give them lashes. Okay, this is the bottom of the paper. We'll stop over here. And we'll continue tomorrow, Mr. Shem.